Live. Hello, everyone watching, and thank you for joining us for our monthly book club with live author Q&A. This month, we are featuring Footmarks, A Journey into Our Restless Past by Dr. Jim Leary, and hosted by myself, Cassandra. Just a little bit about SASA and what we do before we begin. We are the Save Ancient Studies Alliance. Our mission is to promote the study of the ancient world and engagement with our human deeper past, building a grassroots movement through outreach, collaboration, accessibility, and public scholarship. We work toward our goal of inspiring a wide, inclusive community of scholars, learners, and students. You can find us on all of your major social media platforms. Simply search Save Ancient Studies Alliance. Our live event protocol, we just ask that you please be kind and respectful, listen and ask thoughtful questions throughout the event in the chat. And if we have time, we'll read them off as we go. Please be patient with technology and those administering it. Our live events are all live streamed on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook, and they're all recorded and archived. Recordings will be posted on the above platforms shortly after the event. And lastly, have fun. Please do consider becoming a recurring donor. If you enjoy our live events, archaeo gaming, book clubs, and reading groups, please consider becoming a supporter of SASA with a recurring monthly donation. For as little as $3 a month, you can help us save ancient studies. Just go to saveancientstudies.org/donate to learn more. Or for your ease, you can scan that QR code on the right-hand corner of your screen, and it will take you straight to that page. It's the list of our upcoming events. Next weekend, September 16th, we have a masterclass live streaming, Introduction to Old Norse Ritual and Magic with Dr. Minea. It was supposed to be yesterday, but we postponed it for next weekend. And September 12th, this coming Tuesday, Crowing the Ship, we have a Port Ancient Partner update, and we'll be talking to Zilla from Zilla's Athenaeum. And September 18th, a team highlight. If you're interested in learning about what our research team does, consider logging in for that. And lastly, thank you for joining us. Just going to get rid of that now. Okay, so with us today we have Dr. Jim Leary. Dr. Leary is an archaeologist with over 25 years of professional experience. He lectures in archaeology at the University of York and is a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. He was formerly an archaeologist with English Heritage, and before that worked as a professional archaeologist on development sites in London. Jim has directed major excavations across Britain, including Silbury Hill in Wiltshire, the largest Neolithic monument in Europe, and Mardenhenge, a vast prehistoric monument that lies between Avebury and Stonehenge. And in 2018, he was one of 3 people nominated for the prestigious Archaeologist of the Year award by the popular magazine Current Archaeology. And again, thank you for joining us. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, just lovely to be joining you.
Well, thank you for joining us as well. Your book, Footmarks, A Journey in Our Restless Past, just released, I believe, a few weeks ago, correct?
That's right.
Yep. And if anyone watching is interested, you can scan that QR code. It takes you straight to bookshop.org to purchase the book. And if you do purchase it from that link, we here at SASA also get 10% of that from our affiliate program. So please consider doing that. Now, this book overall is about journeys from small, mundane expeditions to big, world-changing ones that we may all be more familiar with. And we all travel, but travel isn't always considered when talking about history. Why did you decide we should talk about movement in terms of archaeology?
Yes. Why did I write about this massive subject that's almost impossible to write about. It really kind of came from a frustration, actually, with the way we talk about movement in archaeology and the way we put it into sites. And I think it really struck me a few years ago when I was excavating, actually at Mardenhenge, which you've just mentioned, this amazing monument, Neolithic monument near Stonehenge, down in Wiltshire. And amazingly, we'd uncovered a Neolithic house surface. So this was a Neolithic house. Obviously, the walls and the roof and everything have gone, but the floor had perfectly preserved, with this big hearth in the middle, a great big fireplace in the middle. And dotted around the floor were bits of flint tools and pieces of pottery that that were left exactly where they'd been dropped, essentially, when that building was last used, and then the whole thing had been covered over by a mound as part of that henge. And I was looking at this, and as archaeologists, we record these things, and we go, "This is amazing. This is an extraordinarily rare find." We can start piecing together different usage for this building. What were they doing in this area and this sector? There's obviously a bit of flint napping going on, and so on and so on. But to me, what it looked like was the morning after the night before. It looked like there'd been like a massive party, and we came to it the next day when all these party goers had gone, and there was all this debris strewn around. And actually, there had been some sort of party. There was huge feasting debris, something like 30 pigs actually, all had been consumed in one go. This wasn't sort of a kitchen midden that developed over time. This was a single activity. So I think there'd been a massive party, a huge feasting, possibly as part of the closure of that building. And of course, it's amazing. It was in all the newspapers, and we recorded it really carefully. And I'm working on the writing it up as a technical monograph. But what really struck me was what we're finding is something that's completely motionless. All the movement has gone, the people have gone, and we're looking at these things on the ground. At the time, that would have been full of dancing and singing and chanting and whirling and storytelling and chatter and excitement. This is the Neolithic period, so it's about 2,500 BCE, so 4,500 years ago. The Neolithic are our first pioneer farmers in the country. It's pre-metal, so it's just at the end of the Stone Age. And we know almost nothing about the society and their religion and so on. And because of that lack of knowledge, we tend to forget to put it in. But of course, they are humans, the same as us, and the activities that would have created that debris, that mess, would have involved this huge amount of movement. And it just really sort of struck me that we are removing routinely these sort of the movement that created this stuff, and that to me is the real action. That's what I really want to get to. Is that so? All of this comes out of a sort of frustration, and even on a bigger scale in archaeology, when we talk about movement, we sort of get these arrows going from one country to another. It probably makes no sense for an audience in the US, but we used to have a program called Dad's Army, and it always started off with these arrows coming from Germany to Britain, and then these arrows pushing the arrows back again. And often when I look at these maps in archaeological books, it looks like that. And actually, and also when we talk about archaeology, we talk about particularly for hunter-gatherers, we talk about optimal foraging strategies and how they would have done this. This is the right thing for economics and all the rest of it. And actually, that makes no sense to my life at all. My life is full of wandering and meandering, and there's loads of things beyond economics that I go moving. I ramble and I roam and I drift and I skip and jump when I'm really happy, and I dance and I do all these things. And of course, the past was completely different, but that would have been true of any period in the past as well. So it comes from all of these frustrations of how we somehow managed to remove movement and focus very much on the place itself. So that's where I came to with it. It comes out of frustration.
That makes sense. And there's been many a project born out of frustration. It helps bring the passion. So what are some of the forms of movement that you explore in Footmarks? It's a whole big range.
Yes, yeah, it's a vast subject, and it was really, really daunting to start with. Actually, I just sat there thinking to myself, I don't even know how I would even get into the subject. It's vast, and for a little while, I thought to myself, well, maybe I'll do a kind of history of walking, and I'll just start off with a very deep past, 3.66 million years ago, and I'll work my way up to modern day. And then I just very quickly realized that that's just never going to work. And there's loads, I should say, there's loads of books. This is part of my frustration. There are loads of books out there called History of Walking, usually by literary people. Rebecca Solnit's Wanderlust comes to mind. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. But for these people, the history is populated by people who write. So it's actually a history of writers that walk. So it's kind of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's walks, or various philosophers, or Charles Dickens' walks around London, or Virginia Woolf's walks. It's sort of almost as if the history is just made up of other writers. Anyway, and I wasn't interested in that. I'm interested in the normal person, the average person, me, basically. I don't care so much for kings and queens. I care for the plebs and the villages and the towns and so on. That's where my ancestry comes from. So I thought, well, I'm not going to do this history of walking. I'm going to have to tackle it in a different way. And I came to this idea that I would conceive the whole book as a journey, going from very short, very small scale. So I start off with footprints, and literally kind of those moments in time, and then each chapter just works its way out from there. So I sort of walk through pathways, and pathways lead to roads, and bigger movements with cattle, transhumance going up into the summer pasture and coming back down, walking with or riding horses, even walking your dog. My dog comes into it quite a lot, I seem to, for some reason, and then eventually, these huge journeys across the world, across the globe, across oceans, and migrations. The amazing stuff that's coming out of ancient DNA studies at the moment, and chemical isotope studies, which I'm happy to talk about if you want to talk a little bit about that. But they're all described in the book, and they're giving us a sense of these big migrations and diasporas across the world. So it goes from the very small scale to the large scale, and then ends with boat journeys, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that struck me, and you mentioned your dog when you were writing, you put in a mix of personal anecdotes about journeys you've taken in your own life, and then integrated it into this larger historical narrative. How did you strike a balance between the personal and the professional when you're writing?
Yeah, I mean, it's really a really difficult call, because it's not a memoir, and I'm not very interesting. People don't really want to read about me. But I firmly believe, and I always have firmly believed, that archaeology is only ever excavated in the present. We don't magically transport ourselves into the past when we start digging. So we excavate it in the present. We excavate it with our modern eyes, and we use our modern concerns and thoughts and interpretations when we come to discussing the sites that we're excavating. So it all happens in the present, and the present can't be removed. And I just think that I think that we definitely should acknowledge that fact, and therefore the present needs to be ever present within a book like this. And of course, moving is one of these things that's so it's forgotten about. As I was mentioning, this is part of my frustration. It's forgotten about in discussions, and then we kind of gloss over it, or we turn it into this kind of big homogenous optimal foraging strategies, or people, doing nomadism and sedentism and sort of the big scale stuff, and we kind of miss out all of the stuff that makes my life important to me, the smaller scale stuff, the human stuff. So that's what I wanted to keep reminding the reader, but also reminding me that actually, this is relevant to me because, and I do this and this. So I am in there a lot, and Bard, my dog, is in there, and because it's part, he is part of my life. So I just don't think you can remove the present at all. I mean, we could try, but it makes it quite boring, and I think that it kind of helps enliven things when you start adding in the present. And it, included in that things like John Travolta walking as well, which is part of this thing is when we talk about the past, we suddenly become very serious for some reason when we talk about, because archaeology is a science, and archaeology is quite young, and we're still trying to make our way in the world of all these big, much older disciplines like history and geography and sociology and anthropology and so on. Archaeology is a bit of a youngster and a small-time player, and I think there's a little bit of lack of confidence in archaeology, and so we try and cover that by being very scientific about things, and I think which is great. So archaeology is a science, absolutely no doubt, but archaeology is nothing without the social side as well, the sociology side, and which is true of all sciences, incidentally, that it's nothing without these other things that kind of enliven it all. So so anyway, I just think that it's really important to to bring the life back into things, to bring, so when people are reading, I go, well, of course, I do that. I think that, and that's relevant. I can see that. So I bring in John Travolta, particularly that I talk about that opening scene in Saturday Night Fever. I don't know if you've seen the film. It's an amazing film, yes. But I mean, it hasn't dated well, to be honest with you, in various parts, but that opening scene I think is absolutely incredible, and it's the camera is just on John Travolta's feet walking down the street, and he's got this lightness to his movement, coolness, absolutely undoubtedly coolness. He described it later on, because I mean it's a walk that almost made him famous. It made him famous. It makes him that walk. And he later on said, "Oh, it's the walk of coolness." He learned it from his school friends in Brooklyn, and you learn these things, but you learn to walk in a very particular way. And he's got this walk, and of course the camera is just on him. It's not on his face. It's nothing to do with how he looks or anything. It's just on his feet. And in the background, the Bee Gees start singing, "You can tell by the way I walk. I'm a woman's man, no time to talk." Well, I'm not going to sing it, but I'll just plant that earworm in everyone's mind for them, and thank me for it later. But I just, so I open one of the chapters with that scene because it just reminds us all that actually, there are times when people strut, they look cool, and that is true now, all over Britain, people walk in different ways. You've got your geezers that walk in a certain way. You've got your sort of, I'm an academic, so I walk in a particular way. Sometimes my hands behind my back. But if I was from Jamaica or Japan or anywhere, I would walk differently. So we walk culturally, and that's true. Going way, way back, to the Roman period, people were taught to walk the right way. If you were an elite male, you had to walk the right way. You were made to walk the right way. There were entire schools there for to teach people to walk the right way. They had to walk in a considered way. You didn't hurry because slaves hurried. But you had to look confident. You knew where you were going, and so on. Women had to walk, according to Ovid. Women had to. They shouldn't flounce, whatever flouncing is. But
every woman flounces through the street. It's just what we do.
But they shouldn't. But he also says they shouldn't plod along like the sunburnt wife of an Umbrian farmer, whatever that is. Big straddling strides, I think he said. So, and for him, the ideal is somewhere in between. So people are taught to walk the right way. Well, if that's true now, and that was true 2,000 years ago in the Roman period, it was probably also true in the Bronze Age or the Neolithic period, and probably the Mesolithic period. There were people that walked in particular ways. It was cultural, and they learned it. And there were probably walks of coolness, and there were walks of more sort of sage-like walks. So this absolutely fascinates me and really engrossed me. So there's a big chunk of the book about that. So I start with John Travolta. So the point is that you can never remove the present when we're discussing the past.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And for what it's worth, I think we all wish we could look like John Travolta as we walked. Just that level of cool. So I guess, why do you think it's so difficult to remember that the past was as full of movement overall as today is?
Yeah, I mean, the reason is because we can't excavate movement. We can't. It's so fleeting. It's sort of something that you can't really see. So, I mean, there was somebody that said, and I can't remember who now, but they said it's a bit like wind. You can't see it. All you can do is see the impact it has on things. And I think that's very true. You can't see, and so when you can't dig up movement, you sort of have to fill the gaps. And if you're being very sort of, if you're writing a technical monograph, filling the gaps is really quite a difficult thing to do, because you're presenting exactly what you found, and we don't find movement so much. There are times, of course, when you can find movement. For example, footprints is one of the few things. So, and I discussed quite a few of the other ways of finding movement in the archaeological record. But I think, it's the fleetingness of it. It doesn't, in a sense, movement doesn't really have a present. It just is. And the other thing I think is that it's so obvious. It's so normal and mundane. Each and every one of us here on this call, on this listening to us on Restream, have moved in some way. Even if it's not very far, we've moved in some way, and it's because of that mundaneness to it. I think it's easy to forget. And I just think, when I started writing about mobility and movement, and put it out on social media, some archaeologists, who shall remain nameless, but I shall silently hate them for the rest of my life, said, "Oh, statement of the bleeding obvious." Well, and I think that's true, and it kind of knocked me out of my stride when I was writing, actually, for a little while, because I thought, well, am I just writing something that is just a statement of the obvious? And then I thought, actually, well, do you know what? Sometimes some things are just so obvious they actually need stating. And there are some things where the obvious is all we've actually got. I deal mostly with prehistory, and actually, that's all we've got to go on. So I think that it's important to state the bleeding obvious sometimes, even if it kind of gets the grumpy so-and-sos going on social media. I think for those reasons, movement lacks a presence. We can't find it. We can't see it so easily, and because it's so obvious, so mundane, that actually we forget about to talk about it. But to me, it's the most primal, the most important thing we should be talking about all the time. Front and center of everything that we do in archaeology and in history should involve movement.
No, absolutely. And I think there'll always be a naysayer somewhere out there, no matter the topic. I know you said it's hard to see movement in the past, and this wasn't on the list of questions I sent you, so I apologize. But you mentioned chemical isotopes before, and I know we have physical foot markings and things like that. What are some of the ways that we can track movement through the past?
Yeah, so I mean, as I say, footprints are one of the ways. and I've got my favourite set of footprints, which I will tell you about before the end of the. I open the book with it. Yeah. So we have footprints. Of course, we have paths and routeways. They're a little more difficult, and maybe we'll come back to them at a later point too. But really, isotopes, so strontium isotopes, oxygen isotopes, and ancient DNA are real game changers, actually, with the way we're talking about movement. And so strontium and oxygen isotopes, these are within the enamel of our teeth. And when we drink water from a particular region, there's a chemical trace in that water because it's being filtered through the geology of that area. And then that gets deposited within your teeth and also within your bones and also in your skin and your hair instantly. And as archaeologists, we can then analyze the chemical traces within the enamel of teeth, and we can work out in a very, very broad way where that person was brought up. So if they're assuming they're adults, their teeth grow and erupt at various points in their life. So some of the teeth happen quite early on, so we can say, well, they spent from the age of 3, 4, 5 years old, they were in this geographic region or geological region, and then other teeth start developing later on, come through later on when they're adolescents, and we can say, well, actually, by the time these teeth have arrived, they've moved to a different geological location, which could be anywhere here. And usually it's very big areas. So it doesn't help us pinpoint. But you can say, particularly I've done a lot of work on the chalk in Wiltshire, and actually you can say, well, they're not on the chalk areas, they're off chalk. And some occasions, actually, we've been able to, and maybe we'll talk about this, but we can identify them coming, say the Amesbury Archer, we know that he came from the Alps, for example. So it actually is helping us pinpoint the locations of people, and where soft tissue is preserved, actually we can get very recent movements just within the last few months. So there's the very famous example is the Egtved girl. This is a Bronze Age burial in Denmark, and she died when she was around about 14, 15 years old. But very unusually, her bones had actually dissolved away, bar just a few teeth. But her soft tissue, so some of her skin preserved, but her hair had preserved, her fingernails had preserved, and actually her clothing was incredibly well preserved. So she was wearing a kind of grass skirt type affair, and she's very, very famous. They've reconstructed her clothing a lot, and her hairstyle and all the rest of it. But actually, what we can, by analysing her hair and her fingernails, we can say in the last few months of her life, she did a huge amount of moving, perhaps as far as Norway and back again and stuff. So actually, through these chemical analysis, we're actually getting really fine-grained, in some cases, really fine-grained movements of people. Absolutely, it's completely mind-blowing. It's almost, to my mind, it's almost science fiction stuff. And then the other big thing, of course, is ancient DNA. And now we can get ancient DNA from skeletons relatively easily. And we, contained within one person's DNA is their entire population history behind them, and that's absolutely turning over huge, entire careers from big professors in archaeology. Their entire life's work has been turned over, and actually that's not true. What we can see, at the beginning of the Neolithic in Britain, an almost 90% replacement of the population. Again, in the beginning of the Bronze Age, big groups of people moving in. So we're seeing these huge waves of migration all around the world. And essentially, I think the long and the short of it is that we're all migrants in a sense. We're all migrants and descended from migrants, and there is no kind of I don't know, racial purity that people like to say that there is, and you can argue with that, but the science will not change. That is just a fact. So It's just, so anyway, some just remarkable things coming. So that's where, those last few chapters of my book where I'm talking about the bigger movements really kind of wouldn't have been possible even just a few years ago.
No, it's really interesting. And I think, at least as far as history goes, I can't speak towards archaeology 100%. I know we tend to put these boundaries of place around topics. Like even in ancient history, we've got Roman historians, Egyptian historians, Greek historians, but none of those civilizations stayed static. No, they were all moving and interacting. Does studying the past through movement help to remove those boundaries of place?
Absolutely, it does. Yeah, and archaeology, we love place. We love to put boundaries around things. We go to these monuments. We can be in, we go to a site. We can be in a monument. We love to do that. And actually, we have a form of protection. If it's a really important site, nationally important, where there's a form of protection known as a scheduled monument, and that's just simply a case of drawing a line around a site and saying, right, now that's protected. So we love creating these boundaries. And actually what movement does, once we add movement in, is break those boundaries down. It really struck me that paths, and particularly holloways are kind of paths that have been used so often, and in the right geology, they've worn down, and they can wear down by meters, 6, 7, 8, sometimes 10 meters deep into the ground. Absolutely extraordinary things. Anyone that follows me on Twitter knows of my obsession with these things, and I put pictures up all the time of the holloways that I walk. There we go. But these things, very few of them are ever protected. In fact, there's only one holloway that I can find that's actually protected with a scheduled monument, and that was only because they thought it was a Roman road. They would never have done it if they had known it was just a bog standard holloway. But these holloways can be old. I mean, they can be sometimes thousands of years old. They need to be pretty ancient to have so many feet to kind of wear them down. But my former colleague Martin Bell has managed to date one holloway down in Kent, in the south of England, to the end of the Bronze Age, the beginning of the Iron Age. So these are features with huge heritage to them, and yet they're not scheduled. And the reason they're not scheduled is because they are really long and linear and go just like cross lots of different landowners' land. So they're really hard to manage, and I think this is part of it. We like to bound our sites, put these circles around them, and say, well, that's important. And in a sense, once you add in movement and start talking about paths and routeways and stuff, it kind of upsets the status quo, and so historic England really struggled to. They don't quite know what to do with these things, actually, but they do require some sort of protection because they're being scoured away all the time. So I think we do. I think we have a real problem. The fact that we're not talking about movement very much, for one thing, but also the fact that we're kind of almost, in a sense, very obsessed with the idea of place and putting boundaries around things. And I think movement really upsets that. Yeah, makes it much more porous. And of course, when we're talking about a place, whatever that is, whether it's a monument or a monument complex or a town, a city, whatever, is actually an entanglement of lots and lots of movements, lots of paths. That's all it is. It's a knot of paths is what a place is. You go to anywhere, London, York, Rhode Island, and it is just you look around you and everything is based around movement, whether it's roads, whether it's alleyways, whether it's sidewalks or whatever, cycle routes. It's all to do, and even going into a shop actually is all about sending you around in a particular way, making sure that you've visited all of these lovely aisles so that you can buy more of their stuff and make them even richer. It's all about movement. Everything's about movement. We even have stairs that will just glide you neatly up to the next floor, where there's a whole load of other wondrous things that you can also buy and fill your house with. So yeah, places movements.
Absolutely. And for those interested, you can follow Dr. Leary on Twitter at Jim_Leary. I put that on the page as well for everyone to see. And just a reminder, please send in your questions and comments in the chat. We'll have time. If anyone watching has a question, I'll read them out for Dr. Leary. Now, sticking with the theme of our last question a bit, you write in chapter 1, so pretty much right off the bat in your book, that history is not motionless. And scholars will speak of history a lot of the time as something that needs the life brought back into it. It's something that we need to.
It's all that movement going on outside.
It's a movement. Yeah, I got a fire truck just going right by my window right now. So can you speak to that task of reanimating history? And I think a lot of that often will fall onto the shoulders of archaeologists to kind of reconstruct the past.
Yeah, I mean, I think, exactly, is that it is about reanimating it. It's about making it, filling it with life again, and telling some of these sort of lesser stories. But I mean, I suppose I mentioned the footsteps previously, and if I may, I want to talk about those just a little bit, because I think they represent a really neat example of how archaeologists can bring movement back in. Mm-hmm. So these are the footsteps I open the book with are a set of footsteps that were created around about 5000 BCE. And so they're Mesolithic, they're before the Neolithic. These are hunter-gatherers. And they're on the foreshore of the Severn Estuary down on the west of Britain. And they've been preserved in sand, and they've been very carefully excavated by a whole group of people, but particularly, again, Martin Bell, who I mentioned earlier, of the Holloway. Martin's been going out every time there's a very low tide. He goes out and records some more of them, and he's got huge, large number of trails of these wonderful footprints, barefooted footprints going out across the estuary. And one that's a couple of these trails that have always struck me, and actually was, in a sense, almost my touchstone for writing this book, it's one trail, but it's two children. One of them is quite young, maybe only 3 or 4 years old, and the other's a little bit older. They may well have been siblings. We don't know, because, of course, we can't tell that from the footprints. But what I loved about it is that one of them is the older child walks in a quite a sensible straight line. They're obviously going somewhere. Maybe they're going to gather some fruit that are growing along the estuary edge, or maybe they're going out to look at a fish trap, or perhaps they're just going for a walk. We don't know. But they're going. The old one's going in quite a straight line. The youngster, of course, is only he or she, only 3 or 4, and they're dancing around the old one, and it's just this chaotic array of footprints, and it reminds me so much of my own children, who when I started writing, were of not dissimilar age, to be honest with you, and so it goes on for a little while with these two walking out, and the youngster really sort of dancing around and all of that, and then at some point the youngster's footprints just disappear. They just stop. But exactly at that point, the older one's footprints are now just a little bit deeper in the sand. And quite clearly, they've bent down and picked up this, perhaps quite annoying younger brother or sister, and carried them for the rest of the journey. And it's just moments like that. You can't, you don't get that from an archive. You don't get that. So, in my opinion, it's so tangible, and it's just so human. It's so beautifully human, and I just absolutely love it. So I start the book with that set of footprints. We have a whole bunch of others, but yeah, it's just such it's just so important to do that, and to remind ourselves that these are people like us. They love and live and laugh and shout and cry, and they had emotions, and they did all the things. Sometimes they do things for crazy reasons, and sometimes they're logical, but quite a lot of the time they're probably not massively logical, or what we would consider as logic. And what the hell is logic anyway? We're all kind of messy creatures doing just trying to get by, really. And that's what these Mesolithic footprints said to me anyway. So it's just wonderful. But I love archaeology.
Yes. Yes, I love archaeology for that reason myself. It allows you to see things that you don't normally see in the historical record. So Footmarks, it covers a wide range of periods we've talked about, and things from old ancient footprints to John Travolta. How did you decide what to incorporate in the book? There's a lot that you could have put in here.
Yeah, there is, and it's a really, really difficult thing. I think probably, realizing that I wasn't going to go chronologically. So when you read the book, and or if you guys out there do read the book, then what you'll realize is that I quite happily flip between modern day, maybe a few centuries ago, right back into our deep past, then to the Romans, back to the modern day. And that might even happen on a single page, actually. So that hasn't got that chronological order. And so we're not, and I've talked about the reasons why I've done that, and I've talked about the reasons why I didn't want to do a chronological walk. I mean, I don't think I could do sort of a proper history of walking. I don't think you can do that unless you focus on literary authors or whatever, philosophers walking around their park or something. So I just kind of focused really on stuff that I found interesting, the stuff that's important to me, and work from the assumption that if it makes me laugh, and if I find it just mind-blowingly exciting, then my readers will too. And I hope that I've done it some justice with that, really. I hope that when you guys do, if you do read it, that you will go, yeah, I can see why you've included that. I could have included many, many different things, and there are loads of sets of footprints I could have chosen, but really I've picked stuff that my life has come into contact with. I've talked about my own sites that I've excavated. I talk about the world around me, because what else could I do, really? So it's really, really difficult knowing what to include. It's really difficult knowing where to stop as well. Especially with a book like this, it could just keep going and going and going, and at some point, you do need to stop, and you do need to consider the reader. And I know that there's kind of a real trend for like massive, great big doorstep books that are 700 or 800 pages long, but that's not what I've produced, because I don't think that's what people want to read. It's not what I want to read.
Yeah, I mean, it can be real hard, especially if you're writing for a popular audience, to suck them into something that long. It looks like we do have a question come in, so I'm going to read that before I get to my next one. Jane Tenen on YouTube asks, what historical eras does the book cover? You've talked about Mesolithic people and John Travolta, but what are the actual foci?
Yeah, so I mean, there is no actual focus at all. It's the focus really is going from that small scale to the large scale. So that's what I was focused on, and I draw on different periods. So I talk about, for example, Mary Leakey's Australopithecus afarense footprints and Laetoli. They're absolutely fascinating. They're from 3.66 million years ago. And there's an amazing story, incidentally, about their discovery, which I had no idea on when I started writing about it. So I won't go into it now. So it covers from that period. I run through There's some amazing Paleolithic footprints. So Homo erectus, Neanderthal footprints, early Homo sapiens, largely preserved in caves. Actually, my other favourite set of footprints is some children in a cave. And I forget where exactly, maybe in France. But there was a whole sort of array of footprints. And actually what they do is get modern day trackers from different countries to come and analyze these footprints and reconstruct what all these footprints mean. And it gives us a very fine-grained movement of people around these caves, some of which have cave paintings, and clearly the movements in the footprints in the mud relate to the paintings themselves. But my absolute favorite of these are a little group of children who were all walking on their heels like this. Well, you can't really see me doing it, but I'm walking, and I remember doing that as a kid, especially when I was really bored. And I'm just, I really fondly imagine these kids in a cave with their parents doing, whatever they're doing that involves painting, perhaps, and they're just in the background, just quietly walking on their heels. And there was a whole little discussion about, what's the ritual meaning of this walking on the heels. I just thought, it's just kids being bored. So anyway, I deal with that, and there's lots of lovely, footprinty stories. And then we talk about Neolithic, Mesolithic, the Neolithic, my site near Stonehenge. We've got Bronze Age movements. I talk a lot about Roman movements, Iron Age roads, Roman roads, of course. That's a really big, important part of it. It's Roman roads, and I won't give it all away now, but Roman roads aren't all straight. And guess what? The Romans didn't necessarily introduce road system to Britain. The Iron Age were engineering their own roads before that. Anyway, so there's some nice little treats in there. And then I talk quite a lot about so it takes us through medieval movement, medieval roads, travelers on roads, what I term nobility mobility. So there's kings and queens who were almost perpetually on the move throughout their reign. But the sort of the big groups of people that you get hanging off the back of these, from not just all the noble people, but then all the other people and the courtiers but then also the servants and the court jesters, and then the tradespeople and the whatever, and then everything that's sort of hanging off the back of that. So great big trains of people moving throughout the medieval period. This whole concept that I've heard said a number of times, which is in the medieval period, people didn't move much beyond their own village. It's just not true. I mean, people were moving around all the time, moving for work, moving for various other reasons. And there's a whole period in the medieval period, and then again in the 19th century, known as the enclosures in Britain, a terrible, terrible period where where villages were depopulated and moved out of their villages. Those places actually then become motionless, because this is all because sheep were more worth. Wool prices were very high. Sheep were worth more than tenants in these houses for the big landowners. So they just got rid of them, demolished their houses, turned it over to sheep. They become, these places become completely motionless. But actually, the people themselves become almost perpetually mobile, wandering the streets, looking for, basically trying to sell their own labor at this point, having spent most of their life actually, involved in various industries and businesses, small scale businesses and industries and so on. Anyway, so I talk a lot about that. And then through the post-medieval period, of course, there's a lot about Roman movement, as I discussed, these sort of schools. So it covers every period in different levels, and then comes right the way up to what we shall call the John Travolta era of the modern day.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, when I read the book, it collected these, microcosms, studies of movement, on a smaller scale, and then connected it to a larger story of the movement of humankind overall. So I highly recommend picking up the book if you have a chance. Now, I've got a couple more questions here but feel free to put one in the chat if anyone watching has any more. I have time to read one of those off instead of my own, but otherwise, keep going. Now, what would you say is one of the most interesting facts that you uncovered during your research for this book?
That's an interesting question. I mean, there were so many. It was such a, you know, it was a journey for me. Not to play on the journey thing too much, but it was a real journey of discovery, you know. And I found out so much as I was going. But I think the one thing that really struck me and still strikes me is the development of paths. And this is really, you know, largely focused in the UK, but actually is true of anywhere in the world. Here in the UK, we have lots and lots of footpaths, and along these footpaths are blackberries, crab apples, hazel trees, which produce hazelnuts. These are all food plants, and it's never struck me why they should all be along a path. It's never struck me particularly that they are along a path. It just is. It just is. It's one of these kind of weird things. It's always just been like that, isn't it? And it really, you know, I found it amazing to think that actually these have developed out of those paths. They exist solely for travelers on the path. This is generations of people traveling and either deliberately planting food plants along the path to feed them as they move, but also people, you know, walking along, eating a crab apple and then tossing it to one side, or spitting out the pips as they go, or consuming them and then defecating on the side of the path, which people did in the past. And actually, there's some campsites around here, and I've noticed this summer quite a lot of people are doing that now. Weirdly,
oh, really?
I'm disgusted, but it's been going on for centuries. You know, people are moving, people live along these paths, you know, in a sense, and it might be 1-2 days worth of walking, and so you do need to eat and all these other things. And so, yeah, but anyway, by these movements and the consuming of the food, we've created linear environments, and you step off the path. Beyond that, you know, whether it's woodland or scrubland or moorland or fields or whatever, you don't get blackberries and crab apples and hazelnuts. They only exist in a linear along the, you know, in a sort of linear zone along these paths. And I think that was one of the most mind-blowing things. Like, of course, it makes complete sense, but we never looked for that in the archaeological record. And the other thing is that landowners and councils go along and they widen paths or they eradicate paths all the time, and they remove these plants. And actually, what they're doing is removing generations of growth, not the plants necessarily themselves being very old, but their ancestral plants and the ancestors of those ancestors and so on. The plants themselves were planted probably a very, very long time ago, maybe, you know, well, certainly hundreds, maybe even 1,000 or a few thousand years old. You know, when you think about the Holloway down in Kent, still used as a Holloway now, having been dated to the late Bronze Age, it makes you wonder how old some of these paths are. And the kind of this linear arrangement of food plants along them is no coincidence. So to me, that really kind of, yeah, that definitely blew my mind. I was just like, wow. Really kind of, it makes it different when you walk along a path and you start feeding on some of these things. It makes a big difference to understand that there's a heritage to all of that, and it's something that's very precious, and we need to protect them. So we need to recognize it.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And I had no idea before reading the book how old some of those actually were. I just had no idea. So to wrap up, do you have a favorite journey story? Overall, could be anything, any journey.
Yeah, well, So I do. I have a favorite journey from. This is from archaeology though, and this is going back to something that I just hinted at earlier, which is the Amesbury Archer. He's quite a famous man now. So you may well have heard of him, but not everyone has. So I'll say it anyway. The Amesbury Archer is a Bronze Age, very early Bronze Age burial that was found not far from Stonehenge at a place called Amesbury, and he was buried with lots and lots of arrowheads around him, which is why he got the name the Amesbury Archer, but he's actually also a metal worker and one of the very earliest metal workers in the country. So at the time he came into the country, we were still in the Stone Age, still a Neolithic culture and way of life. And he's one of these very early pioneer, what we call beaker people, because they brought with them a particular style of pottery, very shapely, lovely. I've got a replica on my mantelpiece, very, very beautiful pots, but they're very distinctive of the Bronze Age, of the European Bronze Age. And so he looks very European in the artifacts he has, and it's very different to the way of life all around him. But through ancient DNA and also isotopes, we can see something of his journey. And we can see that he was actually brought up in the Swiss part of the Alps. This is what I hinted at slightly earlier. So he's not from where he ended up. He was brought up in a very different place. We actually can tell that perhaps he's journeyed back there at some point, maybe in adolescence, and then came back again. But he actually at some point picked up a terrible knee injury, which left him limping. And then he ended up being buried at Stonehenge. We don't know, in a very, very, very rich burial, actually. It had sort of gold ear, not an earring, but a ear, kind of some bit of gold folded around the ear, or maybe it was folded around a bit of clothing, but I think probably an ear adornment. Or maybe a hair trestle type adornment. Anyway, some gold, but lots of these arrowheads, but a metalworking stone as well. So he may well have been seen as quite a magical person because he brought with him this new, you sort of smelt, you take a brightly coloured stone and then you smelt it down and you produce something which is all liquidy and then it solidifies into something bronze. And so perhaps he would have been considered as kind of a magician in a sense, but he was obviously afforded a very wealthy burial. But he's one of the very first pioneers, these sort of outriders for a Bronze Age way of life, which was soon to sweep through Britain and we now know largely replaced, genetically speaking, replaced the Neolithic population in the UK. So for me, his journey from the Swiss part of the Alps, possibly along the Rhine and across the North Sea, or maybe down south and across the English Channel. Who knows what his journey was? We can't tell that. But to me, that's the primal journey. That's it's one of these incredible journeys where someone ended up being buried, given a very wealthy burial. Perhaps had a very illustrious life. We don't know, but it started out somewhere so far removed. So to me, that's the best journey. I could have said one of my own journeys, but
no, that was perfect. It's very interesting. I do think it's about time to wrap up. So I want to thank you for your great for the conversation today. Thank people in the chat for the questions that came in. Don't forget to check out the book Footmarks by Dr. Leary. You can scan that QR code, takes you straight to bookshop.org to purchase. And is there any social media you'd like to plug, Jim? Where can people find you? What's coming up next for you?
Well, follow me on Twitter, or at least take a look at me on Twitter, or the website formerly known as the social media site formerly known as Twitter. I'm sure it'll be known as Twitter yet again some point. But that's where I still one of the last few people eking out an existence on this site that was once wonderful and has now become much embittered. But do follow me on that. I am on other social media stuff, but not quite as active as I should be on those. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, thank you again for joining us. I'm going to end the stream now, and you have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you very much. Lovely to speak to you and everyone else out there who I can't see.